live. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Business, Innovation, and Managing Life. I am back in my usual environment here. And let's see, I think we have a whole bunch of questions that were saved up from previous times. I see first one here from Mikhail. Did I ever experience imposter syndrome? Interesting question. Am I confident or arrogant enough or something that the answer to that is no? Pretty close, I would say. You know, there are situations, I suppose, where I can remember, particularly when a project is just sort of broken out in the world. When we just released, I don't know, Wolfram Alpha, or probably much longer ago, Mathematica, or things I wrote about complexity and so on back in the 80s and so on, where I would get invited to kind of very fancy sort of events that were like, you know, the future of science, the sort of the next great things in technology and so on. And there's certainly a few times where I'm like, really, is the thing that I've done actually in this kind of collection of the great future of science, great future of technology, and so on? Now, probably it's a sign of tremendous hubris to say that I think in that I can remember in those cases where, while at the time it was like, really, is this actually that big a deal? In the end, it turned out it was that big a deal, but I didn't know it at the time, so to speak. And it's kind of like, this is, in a sense, whoever it was that said, oh, we're making this list of people that, you know, should come to this grand event or whatever, or be in this grand list of, you know, most interesting, you know, science people of year X or whatever. In the end, it was like, actually, that wasn't such a bad choice, even though to myself, I wasn't yet at the point where I realized that the thing that I'd done was important in this or that way. And one general feature, I suppose, of there's a complicated issue. So, you know, you do things, sometimes you actually understand why they're important. You have some vision for what's going on. You sort of understand what is there in the world, and you understand why what you've done is actually something of significance, importance in the world. But the world as a whole doesn't understand that yet. Maybe it's decades away from understanding it. What do? Do you just sort of say, oh, well, I've got this thing and you don't understand it yet, but it's going to be really cool? Or do you try and tell people this is something that is really important? Now, I have to say, the spending decades saying this is really important. I mean, this is what people who were doing, not my particular situation, but you know, people who were doing machine learning or doing neural nets or string theory. You know, these are two places where those fields wandered in the wilderness for decades before they were sort of became popular, and everybody was like, oh yeah, you've been doing cool stuff all this time. Thank goodness you're still alive at the time when the field comes to life, so to speak, because it might not happen that way. But so that's the thing where sometimes you realize what you've got is quite important, and or you are pretty sure that what you've got is quite important, but the world doesn't recognize it. Sometimes you're not really sure. You know, for me, the things that I've done quite often, I like see a definite direction and can kind of see how to take the steps towards that direction. But the big, you know, historical significance of what one's doing, I don't immediately get that. It takes maybe 5 years, maybe more, to understand what one has done, how what one's done fits into the context of what else is going on. And so, in a sense, there's something of a tendency to undersell and say, oh, shucks, it's just this thing that's the specific steps I've taken, rather than here's the big picture. But sometimes you do understand the big picture. And if you are in the middle of things, you can understand that big picture, sometimes decades ahead of where people at large understand that big picture. And it's sort of a complicated situation, how you communicate those things. I mean, I'm perfectly well aware of the fact that a bunch of things I've done and built and so on, I kind of view as artifacts from the future, in the sense that people look at them sometimes and maybe they'll use technology we built and so on, and they'll say, look, I can do this amazing thing. And their colleagues will say, well, yeah, that's a thing that we knew would one day be possible, but we didn't think that day was now. We thought that day was sometime in the distant future. But this is an artifact that we've created that's sort of been able to be wheeled in from the future, so to speak. Now, sometimes the point at which it becomes like everybody knows that that can be done, and this is a thing one does, that might be 30 years away, 50 years away, I don't know. And so it's complicated then to see how you deal with that. But in the what am I doing here situation, which I think is the typical kind of imposter syndrome kind of thing, I have to say, I have the kind of a flip side of that, sort of interesting, is sometimes I'll go to, I get invited to all kinds of events and things like this, and sometimes, and some of them are very, very fancy, and some of them are not particularly fancy. Sometimes they're ones that involve students, sometimes they're ones that are just about unusual, unexpected subjects, and I'll go there. And sometimes I'm like, it's sort of always a little bit funny when you go to one of these things and people are like, why are you here? Well, because I was invited and I thought it'd be interesting. But that's kind of the other, it's like, how come you're interested in this seemingly obscure thing? Well, I might have some particular reason to be interested in that. And I figure it's a good way to learn what's going on in that area. And somebody invited me to this thing, and so I decided to go. There are, I admit, other situations in which I'm like, the thing didn't turn out to be what I thought it was. And then it's the, why am I here? I shouldn't be here, so to speak. Anyway, a little bit on that. Let's see. Oh boy, here's a question or comment from Carup. As automation and worker reduction at the workplace continues to gather steam, would it make sense to legally reduce further the maximum hours worked per week to avoid mass unemployment? Oh boy, well, I'm not great on the sort of fully socio-political kinds of things, but I have to say, I kind of wonder about the situation where somebody says, you can only work such and such a number of hours per week. That would be terrible for me. I work tons of hours per week. I have no idea how many hours per week I work. And somebody say, how many hours per week are you paid to work? Well, in the CEOing business, for example, particularly if you're a founder, owner, CEO, it's like, how many hours per week are you paid to work? I don't know what even the definition of that is. So I'm not sure about the, wouldn't it be a nice situation if people were working because they wanted to work, so to speak, and because they wanted to do what they're doing. I suppose the, these are, there's no great economic theory that I know of that sort of solves all of those problems. But I think in the question of right now is perhaps not the time to ask about mass unemployment, because from what I can tell, it's this really strange situation of lots of places where there's sort of shortages of people. I know, we have a number of positions that we're trying to fill, which usually we would have hundreds and hundreds of applicants for, and we have almost none, including one for a sort of operational assistant for me. So anybody out there who's interested in learning all kinds of interesting stuff, that's an open position as of right now. But normally we would have hundreds of applicants for such a position, and we've had very few. And I don't take it personally, but it's just a statement about the economy today, and it's very confusing to me. I mean, it's very confusing the extent to which I'm not a big fan of the whole kind of lockdown for the Zoom crowd type thing that was executed. I think it doesn't make that much scientific sense, and it makes socially it's kind of horrible. And that presumably connects to, together with various economic stimulus kinds of things, presumably connects to this bizarre situation today where if you say, you might say, gosh, all this automation that's come in, that must mean that everybody's out of work, but somehow there are all these positions and nobody can fill them. So I don't quite know how that fits together. But in terms of, will automation kind of put everybody out of work? Automation is a story of kind of leveraging, using technology to leverage what we want to do. And I've tried to do various studies actually about sort of the evolution of jobs over the last 150 years or so. And the thing that's interesting is there's always kind of a new thing that people end up finding that they want to do. It's whereas there's some job category, I don't know, agricultural workers, where a lot of that got automated away in a country like the US. But it's the thing that the question is, okay, as agricultural work dropped off, so other kinds of work grew. Some of the ones that one identifies growing, there's things like healthcare and some education stuff. There's also sort of bureaucracy grows. If you look at just the history of jobs in the US, let's say over the last 150 years, kind of the basically governmental related bureaucracy definitely is a big category that grows. And there are other categories that go up and down, like construction and manufacturing and so on. But what's sort of interesting is that at any given time, there always seem to be new emerging job categories. I mean, who knew that there would be job categories that are basically about live streaming? That wasn't a thing. Or that there would be job categories about, like, for example, just, I always kind of find it interesting to create new job titles, basically, for new things we realize we want done. So one that I just invented like 2 days ago was a group we'll probably call deployment engineering, which has to do with in getting software out. Well, we've had for a long time, we have development, we have quality assurance, we have release engineering, which is sort of actually packaging up software so that it is shippable to places. We have things like cloud development and so on. But there's this notion of deployment engineering, which is, okay, you've got your software and now you want it to run in a container on a cloud server, let's say, or you want to have it be something where it isn't quite release engineering, which is kind of, there's this bag of bits and you're going to send them to people. And it isn't DevOps, which is we're running our own servers and we're trying to get them to do the right thing. It's something in between those things. It has to do with the engineering of deployable things. And it's something which mixes kind of the DevOps thing where there's a definite server in front of you and you're trying to make software run on it, and the release engineering thing where it's like, we're just going to send out bags of bits to people. It's somewhere in the middle of those two. And it has all kinds of particular expertise that's needed. And, it's a slightly new category of position that hasn't existed before, that has been created by the sort of evolution of technology and evolution of what people want to do with technology. So one of the things that I think it's sort of interesting to see is this, this sort of evolution of different kinds of jobs that become available. I mean, I also think that the question of, do people have both one thing they're doing at a time, or do they have multiple things they do? And also, do they have just one career in their lives, or do they have multiple ones? And one thing at our company, we have an internal database we call Who Knows What, which is kind of a place where people fill out. We have all kinds of somewhat interesting questions about sort of what people's experience in doing, I don't know, education or their certifications or what magazines they read, all kinds of things like this. the purpose of this for us internally as a company is, oh, we want to know, is that we also have questions on there, things like things you would like to learn about, those kinds of things. And so when we have new roles that we're interested in filling, the who knows what database is super useful to try and figure out people for whom, oh, that would be a really interesting role. It's also useful when we just want to know things and we can find an internal expert who's knows about some particular obscure thing, place, organization, whatever else. Or even, for example, the what magazines do you read, what websites do you look at? It's like, well, we're thinking about having some interaction with this place, and we don't really understand what kind of a thing shows up there. And if we have 5 people in the company who say, oh, I look at that every day or every week or whatever, you can ask them, and is this something that would be suitable for that, given that they know both that thing and something about what we as a company have. So it's a very useful thing. But the thing that I've noticed about who knows what is that the number of people at our company, and I don't know how untypical or typical we are in this regard, who have some kind of reasonably serious hobby is very large. And those things that are their hobbies, sometimes they'll be things that I'm sure people get paid to do. Sometimes they're things they just do for fun. But there are these kind of multiple tracks that people seem to develop in their lives. And I suppose, for me, for example, it's like doing these live streams is not, this is a hobby, so to speak, relative to what I normally do for a living, so to speak. And I think it's sort of an interesting question, the extent to which going forward, people will have multiple threads that they pursue. I mean, not just the job and the family and whatever, but various different kinds of activities at various levels of hobbiness. And that might include, gig economy kinds of things that are the extra kind of, work that gets done and so on. So I think, and, I don't know how all that relates to what, what will happen. I have to say, and perhaps this betrays a little bit of personal prejudice on my part, any of these schemes that say, let's have the government tell people you can only work X number of hours per week or something. I mean, I tend to think that that's a formula for bad things to happen, and also something for which there are likely to be terrible unintended consequences. I mean, I noticed just recently, and I have no idea what its consequences will be, this thing in China for gaming companies, and don't let kids play video games for more than X number of hours per day during the school week type thing. I have no idea when you think about a rule like that, what its real consequences are. I mean, then every game gets tagged as, well, it's really educational. I don't know. I have no idea whether that's what happens. But somehow I feel like that's, then you realize, oh my gosh, there's a whole generation of kids that would have learnt using video games how to do some amazingly important action thing in the world. And oh gosh, none of them learnt it because we stopped them playing video games. I mean, I kind of think that these kind of, let's just come in and manage the world that way is not a generally successful kind of activity. I think that perhaps I'm prejudiced in this partly from, just my observation of the world, but also a little bit from science. This whole phenomenon of computational irreducibility, even when you know the rules by which a system operates, to know what will actually happen in the system requires sort of irreducible amounts of computation. That kind of tells you that any kind of system you set up of rules, we're going to control things, we're going to put in this rule, we're going to put in this rule, we're going to put in this rule, there will always be unintended consequences. And you'll have to say, well, in the end, oh, we'll patch it, we'll add this other rule, we'll do this other thing. But in the end, the idea, we'll just set up these rules. These rules are brilliant. They're going to, make everything work. And then you roll time forward, and it's like, oh my gosh, we didn't think of this feature. We didn't think of this thing that happened. And I kind of think that the more one's trying to sort of get in there and be very precise about these rules, the more brittleness one's going to end up finding there. I think, another question one might ask is questions about, oh, I don't know, the structure of the economy and who gets paid to do what and how that all works, and the flow of money or the flow of whatever it is that is the equivalent of value in an economy or whatever, how that should all work. And, occasionally people have these grand theories about, if we just do this, everything will work perfectly. In this kind of law of unintended consequences, that seems to be not, in history doesn't suggest that that really works. Now, are there ways that, particularly as we can inject more kind of automation and AI into the whole operation of the economy, are there different ways to set things up? Are there different ways to make decisions collectively as a society? Are there different ways to sort of set up the flow of value around the economy? I think the answer is quite possibly yes, but I'm not sure what they are yet. And I'm certainly extremely reluctant to say, oh, there's this great theory. If you only do this, everybody's going to be happy. Everything's going to work perfectly. I don't see that easily happening. And I have to say that I think the concept, I mean, it is interesting to be talking about mass unemployment just this month, because that sure isn't what people see. I mean, I'm just as a piece of pure amusement, as my I'm a person of great habit, and so every day I'll have a turkey sandwich for lunch. Well, as of today, apparently there's a turkey shortage, and presumably that's because of, I don't know, some whole chain of meat processing workers, shortages and things like this. I don't think it's that the turkeys walked off the job, so to speak. I don't think it's that the turkeys all got COVID. I'm not sure if birds do. I know that around where I live, I've been noticing there are a bunch of deer around here. And one of the really odd things is that you see deer doing things that they don't usually do, being very sluggish and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm kind of having the suspicion that just in the last few weeks that the deer got sick. Hopefully they'll recover and be prancing around just fine soon. But anyway, but that's off topic. All right, let's see. Well, there's a question here from Frost saying, you ultimately named your company with your last name. Why? I've mixed feelings about this. So, I sometimes thought about having this kind of club for people who've named their companies after themselves. And I've sometimes wondered, what is the common theme between people who've done that? Whether it's the Mike Bloomberg, Michael Dell, I don't know, Tim O'Reilly, I don't know. In the tech industry, there's a tech industry, it's less common. In something like law firms, it's absolutely the way it's done. Publishing companies, it used to be the way it was done. Lots of kind of just general businesses, it used to be the typical way it was done was name it after yourself, or it would be, so-and-so and sons, or so-and-so. I've never seen so-and-so and children. Maybe that would be a thing of modern times. I think the thing that, well, first of all, okay, the thing that seems to be in common is people who actually want to take responsibility and sort of for their companies, as opposed to just, I'm doing this thing and, well, I happen to be its founder, CEO, but it's really a thing that's not sort of something that I'm really taking responsibility for. Now, the other dynamic is that when there are venture capitalists, institutional investors of various kinds, they, I suspect, hate companies named after people, because if you're an investor and you say, well, this company is a decent idea and this person who's running it, well, they're okay. But, in a couple of years, well, maybe the company will outgrow them and we want to oust them. And it's like, okay, the company is called, Smith and Company, and we're ousting Smith. That's an awkward situation. And so it's often better to have kind of an anodyne name for a company where it's like, well, it could be run by Smith, it could be run by Jones, that's kind of a detail, but as investors, we can just swap out Smith and Jones as we choose. I think in terms of my company, the reason that I ended up naming it, putting my name on it, several reasons. First thing was that I had the experience of seeing companies that named themselves according to what they thought they were doing, and that turned out to be a disaster. I mean, in a sense, we are kind of living part of that issue because we have our flagship product, Mathematica, which as a name was a good starter name, but now it's a name that we have deeply outgrown in the sense that, people who use Mathematica for mathy kinds of things might be, I don't know, 10% of its users. They're very enthusiastic, they're very good users, they're ones we really like, but it's only 10% probably. And so, but then there are other people where you present them with a product and they say, oh, it's called Mathematica. Oh, we don't do math here. We just do machine learning. We just do data science. We just do something else, which Mathematica or Wolfram language does great, but the name kind of locks one in to a certain view of what's going on. And I didn't want to do that with our company. I'd had the experience, one particular company that I had been a consultant for and actually have been involved in suggesting the name was a company, Thinking Machines Corporation, which was originally supposed to be a parallel computers, AI, this is in the 1980s, AI kind of company, but it kind of evolved to being more of a supercomputer-ish company. And that name was quite a millstone, I would say, for that company. And so things like that made me not want to give a name that was too much, oh, this is exactly what we do. Now, I suppose in a sense, I dodged that bullet for the company. I didn't dodge that bullet for our product name. But in terms of, do you name the company after yourself, for example, I have to say, there is one feature, particularly when I started our company, I was fairly young, I was like 25, 26, 26, I think. Well, in these days, it's not so uncommon to have young sort of founders of companies and so on, but there's a certain feature of, you say, oh, there's this company. How are you involved with that company? What's your role in it? And sometimes when you talk to people who say, I was involved in this famous company, and you say, well, what was your role in that famous company? And sometimes they'll say, well, I was, I kind of was doing some very, I happened to be the person, arranging the offices or something for that company or some such other thing. And it's not really related to the direct mission of the company, as that was the business it was in. To know how involved somebody was, or somebody else might say, well, actually, I was the founder, whatever that means. Well, if their name is on the company, you kind of know that that was for real, so to speak, because otherwise it's kind of hard to, that's hard to explain. Oh, well, I'm Smith, but the company was named Jones. And really, I was involved very deeply in it, but it was named Smith. And I think that that's another feature. I would say that there's a certain tendency of people saying, I want to talk to the person in charge. Okay, well, if your name is on the company, eventually they'll say, I want to talk to the person whose name is on the company. I would say that's not a tremendously important effect, particularly when the company is of decent size. That's not something where people expect that. I think that another thing is, oh, well, every important customer, has to talk to the person whose name is on the company. That doesn't happen that way. I don't think those downsides are really a big thing. The other issue is, okay, so, if your name's on the company, you're kind of on the hook. You can't, your personal brand, so to speak, is connected to the company. And if if something terrible happens and you're kind of declared an axe murderer or something, then that's bad for the, for the brand of the company. I guess I I like to think that I do sensible enough things that that's not really an issue in my case, but I can see in other people's case, it's like you're not quite as free to do goofy things because those goofy things might sort of bounce back to harm not just you, but also the company. And it's sort of easier to if there isn't that extra entanglement. But I think the most relevant thing is how much responsibility do you want to take for the thing you are creating, and to what extent do you want to be free to have the company do something different, and to what extent do you want to burn, for example, if you're planning a company where you think the lifespan of it will be 5 years, let's say, maybe even 10, and you're going to build it up, it's going to be a company that does this, you're eventually going to sell it to somebody else and it'll get absorbed into some larger thing, it doesn't so much matter. And maybe you're better off giving it a name that just says, our company does this, rather than, and also if you personally don't think you're signing up for kind of the long term, then, it's a good way to not, as soon as you've named a company after yourself, you're kind of stuck with it. And the other thing that can happen is people can do things like they sell the company and then they've sold their name. And then there's a whole complicated, mess as they try and say, well, I'm going to do something different now. And then their old company will come attack them for, but you're using your name. And I think there's a general principle in trademark kinds of things that if it's your name, you can use it to as the name of a company. Although that meant that, I don't know, back in the day, there were, I think there was a thing with the Bell Telephone Company back when that was the dominant telecom company in the US, where there was some person whose last name was Bell, who was starting a small phone company somewhere in, I don't know, Texas or something. And it's like, can they do that? Or is that, because it is after all their name? And I don't know exactly how that resolved. But, so I would say if you're really interested in doing things for the long term and you are prepared to sort of take responsibility for it, then use your name. Otherwise, don't. Would be my basic thoughts on that. Let's see. Okay, a question from Riff. What are my thoughts on science and efficiency? Do you believe that high-profile science experiments could be done more efficiently in order to achieve a particular discovery? Is there room for imagination and creativity in unconventional methods in the scientific field? So most of what I do is theoretical science, and the answer there is the sort of the mainstream giant industrial process of producing scientific research is actually pretty inefficient and almost negative for sort of the most innovative, biggest jumps. The giant industrial machine of scientific research is well optimized for incremental progress, which is most of what happens in science. And it's not that incremental progress isn't worth having, it is. Incremental progress gradually makes progress and gets you places. But if you are doing something where there's sort of a big jump that gets made, that the existence of that giant industrial process is typically a negative, because people will say, how can you make that big jump? Everybody knows science progresses through this big industrial process. There's something wrong with making that jump. And certainly, I've had the good fortune to be in a position to make a few jumps in science, which I have done very much. Well, I would say that the things I've done are very connected to mainstream in terms of using its methods, techniques, people, even sometimes a few institutions, but the actual daily progress of what's been done is probably very different from that. And the kind of, and even, for example, the communication of, we've got these big things to communicate. Well, writing this incremental paper in some journal that should report just a little piece of progress here or there. That's a terrible way to communicate kind of a big jump of progress. Because if people see, well, there's this paper and it's reporting this incremental thing, and the paper can say, I'm telling you something really important, but it's still a paper embedded in some journal along with a lot of other papers that are reporting incremental progress. So I think that that's a difficult thing there. Now, in terms of more experimental science, of, how do you make serious progress on things, I have to say, I think there's tremendous room for more energetic strategy in those directions. And it's always interesting to see people who have been entrepreneurs who end up becoming large funders of science, particularly in medical areas and so on, have this tremendous habit of saying, let's use kind of entrepreneurial methods to try and make forward progress here. Let's make plans, let's get people together, let's do this, let's do that. And quite often they have good results. And sometimes you look at what's otherwise being done and it's this giant kind of random walk forwards, as opposed to let's try and have a strategic plan. Let's ask the question, for example, in many fields, there are things where people have concluded it's impossible. I remember cloning was one of those things. Mammalian cloning was one of those things where people for years had just said, it's impossible. Yeah, it works with amphibians, it works with other things, but for mammals, it's impossible. Okay, why'd you say that? But, and I would ask people this and they would say, well, it's never been done. Well, it's kind of crazy. Okay, why is it impossible? Well, turns out in the end, it wasn't impossible, but the field gets this idea it's impossible. So the question is, how do you break through the it's impossible thing? And sometimes you just have to have a person who creates what I suppose one might call from the kind of Steve Jobs tech industry kind of way of describing it, a reality distortion field. Look, people, it's not impossible. Here's a few ideas for how this might be done. Let's go just try and climb that mountain. And the first step in climbing the mountain is realizing there's a mountain there to be climbed. And if you're saying, well, it's just not a thing, it's just impossible, there's nothing there, you're never going to get to the top of the mountain if you didn't identify that there was a mountain there to begin with. So I think that that's something which tends to require a kind of leadership that is not so common in kind of giant industrialized science, so to speak, because the kind of leadership that says, let's go do this incredible impossible thing is something that tends to not play particularly well with the large institutional structure of science as it is right now. Now, and it also doesn't play that well with the funding structure of science as it is right now, because often, when one's dealing with government funding and things, it's partly a sort of popularity contest of there are all these people who are saying who should get more funding, and they're all people who've gotten funding before and things like this. And it's like, let's just continue passing this around the club type thing. And if there's something that is really innovative, I mean, even the structure of saying, let's get 5 people to look at this and let's make sure that they all say it's okay, that's kind of an almost guaranteed way to sort of not end up with something that's kind of highly innovative. So I think the question of how do you inject strategy and leadership, and there are some efforts to do that. In the US government, for example, there are different funding agencies that, like DARPA is one that tries to sort of do the innovative, but it has a rather particular type of innovative that involves blocks of money of a certain size, building physical hardware kinds of things and so on. It's not it doesn't fit all possible pieces of progress in science, but it's sort of an interesting experiment, or not so much experiment anymore after all these decades, but an interesting way of thinking. We're going to have some kind of high risk piece of the portfolio, but in lots of science that doesn't really apply. And I tend to think that it would be great if there was more ability to sort of have more innovation happen in science. And sometimes when there's private funding for science that sort of doesn't go through government channels, there's more possibility to just say, oh, there's a person who's interested in, I don't know, extraterrestrial intelligence, finding out whether, what are they called now? UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena or something, are a real thing, these kinds of things. When there's a question which has been sort of pushed out of mainstream science because it doesn't fit the sort of the machine there. It's kind of like if some private person wants to just say, I'm going to put a bunch of money into this, that can be a useful thing. Sometimes that doesn't play particularly well because the people who can receive that money are people who are part of the mainstream industrial science kind of world. And it tends to be the case that they're so used to doing the things that are part of that mainstream process that even though somebody says, hey, we really want to, let you guys do the thing you've always wanted to do and look at this really wacky idea, there'll be a tendency to sort of revert back to, well, let's not do quite that idea. Let's do the thing that's close to the mainstream direction. And that's sort of a disappointing piece to the whole thing. There's a question here from Ori. How can people in school in general have stronger self-organization I'm thinking that might be self-confidence, to be able to stand up to the institutionalized networks with unfortunate entry conditions? Yeah, this is a complicated thing. I mean, in any place where this is one of the features of sort of modern times that I think gets progressively worse in some ways. That is, there was a time when, I don't know, you applied to some fancy school of some kind, and it was a sort of personalized process of, do you go there, do you not go there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas now there's a certain tendency to say, let's just put in place these kind of anonymized testing type requirements, or these kind of very very cut and dried kind of criteria. Oh, you need to do this. Oh, you need to do that to be eligible for this. And you get a score above this, then this can work, and otherwise it can't, and so on and so on and so on. And I think that, one thing people sometimes believe about those things is that it sort of helps people who didn't come from the best possible background that gave them the best possible opportunity to be able to kind of jump into the best educational track and things like that. I have to say, maybe I would be attacked for saying it, but I think in the US that's horribly failed. I mean, by the time, you might say, oh, let's just do the raw SAT. And I think that there was a time when people were doing that. But at this point, it's like, let's do SAT prep. Let's do all these things that kind of build a tower that if you already have access to all of those resources, well, yes, you can build that tower. And if you don't, you have a significant disadvantage. I will say that when I was growing up in England, there was an exam called the 11 plus, which was a thing that people did when they were about 11 years old. And that determined there were sort of two tracks for government funded secondary education, grammar schools and comprehensive schools. At least that was what they were called when I was a kid in the 1960s. And I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that system actually worked quite well, in the sense that there were all kinds of people I knew who didn't come from, the fancy all possible resources backgrounds, who did this, 11 plus exam and went to, schools that were very academically oriented and ended up doing very well and going into sort of the top university trajectories and all that kind of thing. And I think, unfortunately, at some point in England, for some reason that I don't know the political history of all of this, the 11 plus exam was scrapped, and this idea of multiple tracks of sort of education was removed. Now, was it sort of ultimately fair? There were surely people who would have benefited. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's the question. Would there be people who would have benefited from the sort of more academic schools who were incorrectly sort of sent in a different direction by that exam? I don't know. I think if you ask about some of the exams in the US and you say, what is it measuring? And, I think the goal of something like SAT is probably to measure, if you went to college X based on this score that you got, would you succeed there? That might be a criterion that it might be trying to measure. But unfortunately, it's been so gamed at this point, it's not clear what it measures with respect to that. But in any case, although there are pieces of that, even that gaming process, that measure something, because it's like, are you prepared to go through all this trouble of doing all this SAT prep to be able to do well in this exam, or can you just not be bothered? And well, I just can't be bothered might be, oh, I go to this college, I can't be bothered to do the classes. Maybe that's because the classes aren't a good fit for you. It's not clear. But as a practical matter, let me make the following comment. At any given time, there are always much more self-selected, for example, educational tracks, even corporate tracks that exist. And they are newer, they are not as famous, but they're good. And I think the challenge for people who say, oh my gosh, I'm being locked out of this or that thing because I didn't go to the exact right school and get the exact right test score and all this kind of thing, I think the thing to do is look for the things that are good and emerging and somewhat self-selected. Now, what tends to happen with those things, and I've seen this with a bunch of educational institutions, for example, is it starts off, this is the kind of the unknown, oh, there's this cool thing, people hear about it. And at that time, it's very self-selecting. It's very much like anybody who wants to go there, who puts the effort in to apply and is going to wind up, being able to go there. And then that set of people who self-select to go to whatever institutional educational thing it is, those people, and by the way, the same thing happens with companies. There are companies where it's like, in the early days of tech company X, it was not super difficult to get hired at this company if you were a person who was prepared to actually go to the trouble of understanding what the company did and why you might fit in, and so on and so on and so on. Then the company grows and it has 100,000 employees, and then there's a HR department with all kinds of very precise criteria that are being used. But the point is, it would have been a great place to work when it was tiny, and and great opportunities there. And so similarly in the educational sector, there are these places, and one could start naming some of them, where at any given time there's sort of an emerging place where it's like, oh, this new college that got started, and it's not yet very famous, but it's, you look at it and it's like, is it good? Is it not good? Well, maybe it's actually pretty good. Or this, summer program, I could tout our summer school, for example, and high school summer camp as examples of this. Those are things where, we get, one of the things we get a lot of applicants, but the people who really want to go and who are really any kind of reasonable fit, typically they'll end up going. And it's not the case, we're not going to look at test scores and this and that and the other, because it's, we're at a different stage. If we had, 500,000 applicants, we would have no choice but to do something where we're, looking at test scores and doing things very quantitatively and so on. But I would say my main advice is to try and find those sort of educational places and corporate places which are sort of emerging, and where they haven't gotten to the point where everybody knows it and everybody wants to go to the same place. And, everybody's just going to be picked by numbers, so to speak. I think that there's also, well, when it comes to jobs and so on, that is a place where sort of, making a connection to a person to be able to, be able to sort of have people understand, because, if person X knows person Y who is involved with the company, then if you want to know about person X, the company has a normalization on person Y, and so they can find out something about person X. Let me give an example of how that works. Let's take recommendation letters. Okay, so when my company was very young, we were sort of, in a sort of pseudo-academic way, we'd like get recommendation letters for people. It was useless, because unless we had a repeated, trade route where we're getting letters from the same person over and over again, so we can normalize them and we can know this is what, this is what this letter means, there's really no information in that letter, because it's like, well, a person who's a friend of mine, actually, who's a well-known professor, years ago, he wrote a couple of letters for people who we were considering hiring. And he's a nice fellow, and he, wrote these very glowing letters. And, we made, they had an effect on our sort of early stage hiring. And the people were absolutely the wrong people to hire. And it's like, you realize it was just a nice person who wants to find the positive in things and writes a glowing letter. It really had no information for us. Now, on the other hand, if it was the case that there was a person who worked at our company, knew what the shtick with our company was, and knew this person who was applying to our company or had some connection to them, then that's a place where it's much easier to be able to tell with normalization, is this actually a person who's going to make sense for us? I would say that recommendation letter story I told you, that was almost a better case of recommendation letter because I knew the person who was writing them, although I didn't know his kind of recommendation letter practices. But in most cases there, it's like person I've never know nothing about is, professor writing a recommendation letter for this person. It's like, there is no normalization. I have no idea. And so that's the kind of networking thing with companies. That's one of the reasons why that's a worthwhile thing, is because that allows, if you know somebody who is involved with the company, who can kind of present you in a way that sort of fits into what the company understands, that's a good thing. I would say that the way, I don't know, for things like college applications, less so graduate school. I don't write many recommendation letters for people, but I sometimes do for people who have worked with us and done really interesting things and so on. I mean, basically my criterion for writing these letters is, if I think I can write a letter that people will actually read, I'll write it. If I don't, I really won't. And, I kind of, because I've done enough marketing writing in my life, I kind of enjoy the challenge of writing kind of and really the issue is, well, for it's like why this person will fit into the program that you have, if in fact I think they will. But one of the things I learned was, I'd done this for, I was starting to do it for people applying to college, and I had terrible success rate. It's like these people were just not getting the things, but I didn't know, the whole spectrum of what their whole sort of, which colleges they would fit in that, little quadrant of test scores and this and that and the other that these colleges end up having. But what I ended up asking a person who had actually run admissions for a large school in the US, I showed her some samples of letters, and she was like, these are great letters for graduate school or jobs or something like that, but they're terrible for college, because people are going to spend, I forget what the time was, 50 seconds or something reading this letter, and it's got to be 3 paragraphs, and it's got to have this structure, and the letter will turn into some kind of grade parameter somewhere in some giant sort of machine that tries to figure these things out. And so I'm not sure how worthwhile these letters are at all, and it would be interesting to know exactly what sort of numbers are assigned to letters that one writes, but it's a different kind of thing. But I think so my main advice is find the emerging places, or find the places where don't just go and crowd into the places that everybody knows. Those places maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago, if you look at places like in the ranking of colleges, which is, by the way, a terrible thing. I mean, the fact that colleges are ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in US News and World Report or something is one of the worst things to happen to higher education, probably in terms of students ever, because, these colleges are all very different. And it's kind of like they are, if you want to find what college to go to, the best exercise is go figure out what actual classes you would do in your first year at the school, and what professors would teach them, and do you like it, do you not like it? And they'll be very different, and also things about what kinds of students go there and so on. There'll be very different things for different colleges. They're really not, it's really not like grade A peaches or something, where you can, I don't even know if it's true there either, that, any grade A, and I'm making it up with, I don't know what the food grading is for peaches, but, any grade A peach is like any other grade A peach. I don't think that's true with colleges at all. They all have different personalities and characteristics. At least the sort of name brand ones do, and perhaps the others do as well. But there's at some level, there's more of there are these textbooks, there are these classes, this is what you're going to get. And by the time you're at that level, it isn't mattering, for the more name brand places, there is a difference in what's being delivered, which people sometimes don't recognize, and often don't recognize, and they just think, oh, there's this ranking. But a thing that's interesting to look at is which are the schools that climbed the ranking over the last, let's say, 20 years. And which are the schools that are right now ranked down at, I don't know, some much lower number, but they seem to be sort of climbing the rankings. Those might be ones to look at, although I'm not necessarily endorsing the rankings in general. But I think it's also these smaller places, these programs that are just like, it's a new and interesting program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the things to do to enter and many of those things are kind of fast tracks to sort of the best possible place you can get to. They're just, people haven't crowded into them yet. They haven't been discovered yet. In 10 years, they will have been discovered, and they'll be industrial like the other places, but they haven't yet. And there's always that opportunity. Let's see. It's a question from Joe. How much of my work in our business is exploration of opportunity versus management? Do I have a set ratio, rules of thumb to regulate between the two? I'm pretty lucky in that I have built an organization where it has enough structure that the traditional, quotes, management is not something that I probably spend that much time on. Now, it depends what you mean by that. Okay, so, I have a pretty structured life, and I'm doing kind of product strategy, designing products, things like that. I spend probably 2/3 of my sort of day job time doing those kinds of things. Sometimes the sort of general, I would say, I spend more of my time on strategy than on management. I mean, management is things like, oh, there's this set of people, there's this set of things to do, how do we plug these things together? I do spend some time on that. Maybe it's a consequence of the fact that I've been doing this stuff for a really long time, that most of those decisions are not super hard to make. I mean, in other words, it's like, I tend to dwell on the things that are really hard, that have to do with product design and so on. And these things where it's like, should we get this person to do this? How should we structure this group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure I can spend an infinite amount of time thinking about that. Perhaps it's just because I've gotten pretty experienced that I don't end up spending that much time on those things. I mean, it helps. Two things help. We have a terrific team of people at the company who in many cases have been working with me for a long time. And it's kind of rather easy to work with them and say, how should we do this? What should we do with that? And fit things together. And plus, I've just been doing it a long time. And so some things where I might agonize, is this going to work? Is that not going to work? Often like right now, we're doing some reorganization of some groups at the company. And so, I'm doing various discussions about that. And it's like, we think about it. And then, in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, it's like, we'll be talking about it and people say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Let's put this person in this place and, do this with that and so on. And we know enough, we're experienced enough to know that's probably going to work. It's a good idea. We didn't have that idea initially. We had to brainstorm it a bit to get to that idea, but that idea is going to work. And we're not like agonizing of thinking about this and that for a long time. Now actually implementing some of these things. So there's a different issue with management, which is management, companies are made of people, and people always do crazy things. I mean, I've been managing people, what is it now, for, well, how long? Probably 44 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, one way or another, including sort of, well, I used to manage too much stuff when I was a kid too. But so I've been doing it a long time. And, you might have thought after all these years, you've seen every possible crazy pathological thing of people doing things that don't make any sense for them, don't make any sense for the company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I saw a few of those just in the last week, actually, that I had never seen before, just new, different, weird kinds of situations. And there's a certain thing that you end up doing. It's really worthwhile to understand people as much as you can. And there's a certain function that you end up doing, which is what I would call talking people off ledges. I mean, basically things will happen and people will be like, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. This is terrible. I'm doing all these things and I'm not doing what I want to be doing. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. This is, the sky is falling in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, there is a certain, I suppose a small amount of my time these days, thankfully, it's varied a bit over time, is spent, trying to have people think better about the things that they're trying to do and how what they're doing fits in, and also understand, for them in the role that they're in, the sky seems like it's falling in. Okay, why is that? Is that because they're in the wrong role? Is that because other things that set up around them are just making the sky fall in? Is this just, what is it? What's actually happening? And to try and get people to the point where they realize, sometimes people will get in this sort of situation where they're just really, really convinced about something. They're really, really sure that they're failing at their job or whatever else. So they're really sure about this or that. And looked at from the outside, you can plainly see this is not the case. And so then the question is, how do you actually communicate that? And it can take sometimes a while. I mean, you can have conversations that last hours sometimes. And, in the end, I mean, I've had a great many successes over the years of things where things sort of got out of whack and it was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And you sort of talk it through and eventually people are like, oh, okay, that's fine. And then everything's fine for 20 years. It's not one of these things. There are also cases where you'll find a situation with people, and I'm afraid this is another sort of principle about management that I've noticed. By the time you end up doing repeated, somebody has a sort of a complicated meltdownish thing and it happens once, and some ledge, they ended up going out on that ledge. You talk them back off that ledge, and then it's all plain sailing after that. That's okay. If there's a ledge situation every 2 months, it will never work. Eventually they'll jump off the ledge, or things will fail. It doesn't, by the time it's that kind of squeaky, it never works. Even though you say to yourself, sometimes I say to myself, oh, it's a great person, they're in this great thing. And well, yes, these things keep on going wrong, but, or another thing like that is people where there's just a lot of strife around them in the organization. I mean, where people are, having fights with each other and et cetera, not physical, but some version of, email fights with each other or whatever else. And there are people who are just rather hot-headed and they'll get very, vigorous in their arguments, and that's fine. At least in our organization, we have both the loud and the not loud folk, and I think people have managed to find ways to sort of interact with each other. But that's okay. But it's when it's really what amounts to sort of political strife within the organization, when that happens, and people are the source of that, and people are like, you can pretty much guarantee that will fail eventually. It might take 6 months, it might take a year, but it will eventually fail, at least in our kind of organization. I mean, there are other organizations where the whole management structure is based on internal politics, where I'm sure it's different. Let's see. Oh boy. Well, Satiris comments on one issue keeping back innovation in traditional big industries and their R&D is the difficulty of adopting sort of new paradigms. What's my view? I don't think that's quite the thing. a company, a big company particularly, is built as a machine for doing some particular commercial activity. And it's got all these pieces of machinery in it that all move in that direction. And it's built all these checks and balances and controls and all this kind of thing to help it commercially be successful in that particular direction. So then something else comes along that changes the business model, and you say, hey, this company, there's this thing over here that's really cool, and that's going to be the future. Why don't you go chase it? Well, many companies, and I've seen this even in my own company at different times, many companies will just be, thank you very much, we've got this machine, it works well, it's managed by people who know how to manage it, it's it has low risk, it's being successful, we'll just stick to our machine. And if you say, well, there's this thing over here that's really, really good to chase, they're like, we can't chase that. We just don't have the apparatus to chase it. We have a machine that's been built for this special purpose, so to speak. Now, how do you get around that? It's difficult. In my company, episodically, we have kind of a special projects group. In fact, I think I'm about to recreate our special projects group. And what happens to the special projects group? Why does the special projects group not last? It's a good answer. The special projects group doesn't last because the special projects they do become general projects, in the sense that, I don't know, something like our Wolfram Alpha product started in a special projects group, but after it grew up, it became a mainstream product. And so the people who are in that special projects group mostly just went into doing that mainstream product. In fact, I've had a very hard time maintaining a pure special projects group where people recycle through special projects rather than their project was successful. Now it's becoming a mainstream thing. So then they get, into that sort of industrial machine that's doing that mainstream thing, rather than recycling back onto the next special project. Doesn't help that each special project is a project unto itself with rather different characteristics. And so the people who might be suitable for special project number 1 are different from the people for number 2 and number 3 and so on. But right now I have a bunch of new sort of innovative projects that are just starting. And I think actually in the next couple of days, I'm going to realize I got to bite the bullet and restart our special projects group. The good news is all of the internal email aliases and categorizations in our HR system and so on, they're all there from the previous time we had a special projects group. They've just kind of atrophied because we haven't had one for a few years. But in any case, I think that's, managing special projects is a complicated thing. Some big companies have sort of an innovation group that essentially does that, and they manage them with more or less success. I mean, one of the frustrations with innovation groups at big companies is they bring in a project, they work with some outside organization, everything goes great, but then you think, we're integrated with the innovation group at big company X. You say, that's great. That means we're integrated with big company X. Au contraire, the innovation group then has the problem of selling those innovations to the main part of the company, and that can be super difficult. And certainly there are historical examples, Xerox PARC being a good example, where fantastic things happened in the innovation organization, but they just couldn't be fed to the main organization. And it's a challenging thing. And for many companies, the industrial machine that deals with a product line is such that basically it has machinery that makes sense if that product line is making $1 billion a year. But as soon as you say, well, let's throw it at this embryonic product line that's going to make $5 million a year, it's like, well, it's got these layers of bureaucracy and this and that and the other, and a $5 million a year thing is guaranteed to be totally unprofitable. So it's hard for it to kind of grow because you can't get through that stage because you've got all this machinery that you're trying to use that you're going to apply to this thing that's much too small to have it applied. And so it can never break through the period when it's going to sort of use machinery but not really need the machinery. So that's one of the challenges for big companies. And often what happens in the reality of the modern world is it's much more efficient for big companies to just sort of wait for smaller companies to innovate and do things and then just buy the company and just sort of try to integrate it. How that integration works, that's another huge challenge. And often that integration is surprisingly disappointing. And I certainly know many people who've had companies that they've sold to large tech companies, and usually the story is rather unhappy. Usually the story is, and often those acquisitions, if the small company has been successful in doing something, pragmatically, those acquisitions are often essentially buying mailing lists, more so than they are buying technology and know-how and so on, although that differs in different cases. Let's see. Luis asks, does our company make profit out of sales of software, or does it have other sources of revenue? Interesting question. We actually have a fairly diverse collection of things, but they're all around the same technology, basically. We sell just straight prepackaged software. We sell site licenses, which are a slightly different kind of thing, because they tend to be very long-term. They tend to take a long time to sell, and then they tend to be renewed year after year, forever and ever. And they're a little bit of a different character of thing. They're a little bit more of a partnership with the organization than they are just a straight buy us off the shelf and use it. We also end up getting used in a bunch of OEM situations where our system is embedded within some larger system, whether that's Siri or whether it's some other kind of product or whatever else. That's yet a different kind of business relationship. We also have a consulting organization where it's kind of, we have actually two consulting organizations, one for basically building things where they're well specified directly around our products, and the other is a solutions team that is dealing with things where customer has some bigger sort of strategically defined objective, and it's a question of actually filling that out with a whole strategic plan and then building the actual software around it. Those are, I would say, our main sources of revenue. I mean, there's some smaller pieces from other kinds. Well, and some of the things we also have consumer type things like Wolfram Alpha Pro, which is a few dollars a month kind of thing, versus large scale software licensing, which is very different amounts of money. I would say that we are continually looking at how can we kind of sort of innovate in the way that we, the fundamental thing we want to do is get our technology used by as many people as possible, because we think it's good for the world and it's satisfying and it's just generally a good thing, but also make the money to be able to go on developing the technology in a kind of unfettered way where we can really innovate as well as possible. And we've been lucky enough to be, a private company that's been profitable every year for 33 years now. But we tend to plow most of those profits back into doing more technology development, more innovation, and so on. And that's been something that sort of I've been sort of really a personal decision to do that, but that's what we've been doing all this time. And I think the question of what's the best way to build an ecosystem where you can do sort of unfettered innovation and where you deliver your products to as many people as possible, what's the right place to do that? And for example, there's the whole issue of, what's free, what's not free, what's kind of sort of open source, what's not. I have to say, just today, in fact, just a couple of hours ago, I was super annoyed to see yet another supposedly open source thing saying, oh, actually, we're going to charge people for this. And it's like, come on, guys, don't make the claim of being, sort of opener than thou and freer than thou, and then a few years later just say, well, actually, we're going to charge people a lot of money to use this thing. This is a cheat. And it's something that I have to say I get sort of annoyed by, because people, it happens less nowadays, but people saying, oh, your software isn't open source, that's terrible, you should consider yourselves devils incarnate type thing. And it's like, no, we're trying to be very straightforward and transparent about what we're doing, how this works, you have a thing, you pay this for it, you don't pay for it, depending on what you're doing. It's very straightforward, and there's no kind of, it's free, it's free, it's free, it's wonderful, we're so good. And then, oh, whoops, actually, this thing you've been using and that's now integrated into your company, actually, we're going to come and charge you a bunch of money for that. I think it's a cheat, and I think that I'm sort of disappointed that you hear as much kind of sort of ideological, it's so wonderful, these things are so free, until they're not. It's disappointing that people make that sort of, it's happening decreasingly. I would say that peaked maybe 3-4 years ago, and it's sort of decaying partly because of these cheats being pulled. It's something where I sort of pride ourselves on the fact that we've been really consistent in what we do for over the course of, 33 years or so now, of, these are the mechanisms. This is what, if you use this thing, you pay this, you don't pay this, this is how it works. It's not a kind of bait and switch type situation. But it's something where I'm always interested in, is there another way that I think is sustainable to sort of factor things differently in terms of how do we build this system that allows us to create things, get as many people to use them as possible, and be able to continue innovating. Stefan asks here, do we get takeover proposals from big companies? Of course we do, and have done for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. But it's like, look, I do what I do because I like to do it, and I think I hope we are sort of doing things that are good for the world and that we can feel fulfilled sort of delivering to the world. And the best way I know to do that is the way we're doing it right now. And it's just like, the optimization of, oh, let's just, sell the company to big company X, and, we can make a bunch of money from doing that. And then it'll sort of gradually get ground up by the Borg, so to speak. And it's not to say, I mean, there are big companies, big in the tech industry, that do lots of good things. And it's just a different model. We have done the very bizarre thing of doing very intense innovation for 35 years. And that's very, very, very unusual. And it's been possible because we've kind of set up the ecosystem around what we're doing to be one where that can be done. And it's something where I personally have found that process very fulfilling. I think a lot of people work at our company who also find that process fulfilling. And, that's kind of the thing that I hope for ever to come, so to speak, we'll be able to do with our company. And we actually work with lots of big tech companies, and they license lots of stuff from us and so on. And while it is, saying, oh, we'll just sell you the company, is, we could make much more money that way. I think it is better for everybody, including the big tech companies, to do these deals where we are we're licensing technology, where we're saying we're going to go on innovating. If you take a company that has been quite innovative and you buy it and you put it inside the big industrial machine, you will end up with something typically that isn't very innovative anymore. We've got a better deal on offer, so to speak, which is sort of license our stuff, be able to use it, and we'll keep innovating. We'll keep providing that sort of engine that is what you get by licensing our stuff. And that's kind of the model that we have for that. And I need to go very soon here, but it's a question about what other companies are out doing consistent, good, independent work using a similar model to ours. Oh, boy. I mean, one of the things in the tech industry is that the vast majority of companies have lots of investors. And that creates a dynamic that we have not had. of sort of a desire for certain kinds of results that are not about sort of producing the best stuff. They're more about delivering financial results. And so that tends to make that not work as well. There certainly are companies that I think are doing all sorts of interesting things. But in terms of companies that have been able to stay kind of private and innovative as we have, I mean, there are also companies that are private that are in the tech industry that are actually rather uninnovative, and where they did one thing and they're kind of just, it's like it's not an exciting business, but it's a lucrative business, so to speak. I think we're a pretty unusual case. I'd be interested. I'm sure I'd have I'm sure I'd enjoy the CEOs of whatever companies have similar models, and there certainly are some that are sort of partially similar, and I do enjoy those CEOs. Okay, a couple of more, and then I should wrap up here. From IC, do our employees get motivated when they see the result of people using our technologies? I think so. Some do more than others. It's it's funny because people are motivated in different ways. Some people just like really making the best thing they can make. Some people like seeing that what they've made has an effect. I would say that, I'd like to think so. I think it's sort of good all around. And I think in the aggregate, yes, absolutely. I mean, but I would say that, I kind of feel like for both our employees and, their families and people, their friends and so on, I think it's really nice for people to be able to say this thing that I worked so hard on really has this effect in the world. And even in cases where people are like, oh my gosh, they've been working so hard for months on this thing, and then it comes out and everybody and their friends can, see this is the thing this person was working so hard on. I think that's pretty nice. And I think that dynamic does really work that way. I would say something that I noticed years ago, we have a technology conference with our users and so on. And I think our employees get a real kick out of being, particularly when it's in person with our users, and they'll give a talk about the things they've been working really hard on, and there'll be a whole bunch of people who come up afterwards, and they're all asking all these questions. They're all very enthusiastic. That's a very nice, positive piece of feedback. And I would say that sometimes in the long distant past, we would like there'd be academic conferences about things related to things we were doing R&D on, and our R&D employees would submit papers and so on. And that was just a horrible, very different process of, your paper doesn't refer to so-and-so who's on the program committee, so we're not going to have your paper type thing. And it's like very demotivating. And so at some point I sort of said, let's just not do this. We are getting fantastic feedback from people who are users of our technology, who are very engaged with what we're doing and can give really useful feedback on things. And they're just very positive about things. And that is something that makes our employees feel good about the things they're doing, as they should. And that's what we should concentrate on, rather than trying to say, get the academics to give us, not that there are plenty of users of ours who are academics. And I'm saying kind of the sort of official academic conference of field XYZ that has just a different rhythm to it. All right, there's a question from Melonburst, and this will be the last one I'll do today, about our cryptocurrency efforts, commenting, will we go beyond making an Oracle system, and will we leverage our own computable data to create our own cryptocurrency? So the thing that is sort of, I think, very interesting direction with cryptocurrencies or blockchain in general is the whole notion of computational contracts, and the notion of turning what would otherwise be a legal contract about things in the world into something computational. We do indeed have lots of computable data, and we also have a language which goes a long way towards being able to actually write a contract in our language, so to speak, including, the machine learning classifier that decides whether this or that is a good thing, or, is the right grade of this thing or whatever else by some image processing, vision, machine vision, or some such other thing, whatever it is. We have really good raw material to make essentially computational contracts for things. And so that, I think, is one of our interesting opportunities. We've been working with lots of blockchains, most of the top blockchains, on integrating those blockchains into Wolfram language. That has a lot of value because our language is used by R&D people, which means that those blockchains get used by R&D people. Our language is also used a lot by quant finance people, which means those people can then interact with these blockchains. So that's a really useful thing. And there's a whole sort of educational ecosystem around our language. So that's really useful. But that's at a much more pragmatic level in terms of integrating with blockchains and cryptocurrencies. I think in terms of, so that sort of basic level, integrated into the language and be able to let users of our language do things, people who use those blockchains be able to use our language to sort of build things, including particularly computational contracts. Now, in terms of the operation of blockchains themselves, I hadn't thought that we had much to contribute to that until things happened with our physics project. And I realized that there is a possibility that some of the things that we developed in our physics project will allow one to have sort of another generation of distributed blockchain. And that's something that we've been thinking about. What I realized is to really understand how that works, I need a theory of economics. And so I've been kind of held up on that by a basic science question of, let me understand how economics actually works, what value really is in economics, and then that plays into this rather different rethinking of how one might build a kind of distributed blockchain. But that's something for the future. I would say more recently, the whole world of NFTs, which is kind of a first story of computational contracts, is, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, a lot of very interesting things that can be done. We are in the process of standing up a little spin-off company that has to do with delivering NFTs at a more consumer level. It's something a little different from what we usually do, although what you realize very quickly is, oh, you're minting NFTs, to your live minting NFTs to represent accomplishments in people's lives and so on. Well, that becomes more real if you can actually guarantee that the accomplishment happened. And that means you have to have all sorts of kind of things about the world and data feeds and machine learning and all these kinds of things. And then you have to start worrying about what do the computational contracts look like, about what happens to the NFT if the NFT is a certification kind of thing, what happens to that when it's sold on a secondary market, what is the actual contract, and so on. And so very quickly what we're realizing is that what started as a cute little consumer idea is turning into something which makes pretty deep use of our technology stack and a bunch of the things that we do with computable data and our computational language and all those kinds of things. But that's a coming attraction that we're actually right now, if people are interested, they should let us know. We are trying to put together the kind of initial management team and so on for that effort. And it's going to be sort of a mixture of consumer kinds of things, some with a lot of UX and some kind of algorithmic thinking that is kind of new style algorithmic thinking that, well, it's inventing new things, which is kind of what we end up doing. And I suppose the thing that for us about doing a project like this is there is a way to do this project that is purely, I don't know, I could say unkindly fluffy consumer type thing, as in it's just very simple, layer. But, what will happen as we do this is we'll actually solve the hard problems, and or we'll do our best to solve the hard problems. And that's something that will end up enmeshing with our whole technology stack and possibly even with science that we've done and so on and so on and so on. There's a remarkable habit of discovering that the hammers we have actually do things for the nails that we choose to pursue. And that's partly because those nails that look more attractive to us are ones that we understand better because of the hammers we've built, so to speak. It's also the case that given sort of any particular nail, there is often sort of to do it really well requires sort of pushing the frontiers of what's possible in the sort of science and technology. And we are in a position to do that. And so we do. Whereas other people who are not able to do that will say, well, we can do something without having to solve those hard problems. So let's do that something. And sometimes from a pure commercial, make a quick buck point of view, it's a better thing to do that don't solve the hard problems approach. For us, it's much more interesting to actually solve the hard problems and much more satisfying. I think even at a purely financial level, in the end, it builds a much stronger kind of thing in the long term, although the long term may be very long term. And it might be that you'll be like, oh, if we'd only built the simple thing, somebody would have bought it from us for $1 zillion. But we're laboring building this very, very complicated long-term thing. I just find that more satisfying, and it's sort of a personal choice to do that, even though that might not be the best sort of pure business proposition. So that's probably all I have time for here today. But thank you for a lot of interesting questions, and it's you guys get me to talk about things that I don't usually talk about, and for me that's really interesting, because when I talk about them I start to think them through and understand them, and that's really useful for me. So, well, thanks very much, and see you again another time.